As you'll remember from earlier in the course, we put up a diagram that showed a 5-level control system for managing fatigue-related risk. Level 1 controls were about ensuring that people were provided with an adequate opportunity to rest and recover. And the Level 2 controls were about ensuring that the opportunity to rest had provided somebody with sufficient sleep in order to work safely. Level 1 and 2 controls enabled both the organisation and the individual to discharge their duty of care responsibilities under occupational health and safety law. As we move to higher levels of control in the system, we move away from our legal responsibilities to the use of higher level functions as leading indicators of potential risk. And one of the most obvious indicators of risk are the signs and symptoms associated with fatigue. As many of you will know, it is very unusual for somebody who falls asleep while driving a car to experience sleep onset with no prior warning or knowledge. Most people will yawn, reduce the amount of conversation that they have, stretch, turn up the radio, wind down the window. There will be a whole bunch of behaviours that we see in individuals indicating that they are fatigued and indicating that the level of risk is elevated. The difficulty, however, in most organisations is that we don't formally acknowledge these signs and symptoms of fatigue, and we don't use them as what Jim Reason referred to as a leading indicator. In this section of the course, we will talk about Level 3 controls, and these are tools, technologies and approaches to identifying the signs and symptoms of fatigue and using these as leading indicators or near-miss events that indicate that somebody is fatigued and the need to introduce greater levels of control. When we talk about Level 3 controls, we'll divide those into two broad areas. Level 3 controls at a physiological level have been referred to, for example, as the fatigue gadgets. And fatigue gadgets are technologies which monitor an individual's performance. And by monitoring that individual's performance, use indicators of fatigue to indicate that there is an increased level of risk associated with that particular measure. In this section of the course, we will go through the 7 main areas in which behavioural measures have been developed. We will look at those in terms of how they work and their relative strengths and weaknesses. The second area in this section that we'll look at will be the embedded measures. These are new technologies which monitor not the individual, but how well the individual is performing the task. And as you remember from some of the tasks that we looked at in the fatigue experiments earlier in the course, there are systematic ways in which task performance changes as an individual becomes increasingly fatigued. With the level of computerization in many tasks, particularly in vehicles in this day and age, it becomes extremely reasonable to be able to monitor task performance, and where an individual's performance is consistent with a fatigued individual, for that technology to take some means of intervening or responding or alerting either the operator of the machinery or the system or the supervisor of that individual, so that they are aware of the fact that the individual is fatigued. As you can see from the slide, there are 7 typical systems or approaches to identifying behavioural indicators of fatigue. I'm going to go through each of those in turn and try to explain to you how each of these technologies work. I'm not going to particularly talk about individual brands or particular products or vendors. I don't want to do that because that may be seen as an endorsement or a criticism of particular brands. But at the end of this section, we will go through and talk about the strengths and the weaknesses of each of these technologies and what would be appropriate or not appropriate in terms of their use within a fatigue risk management system. If we take the first of these, that is behavioural response times, there are a number of technologies. These have been around a long time. They typically started in around about the late 1980s and early 1990s, and they were based around a very simple principle. You remember back where we talked about the effects of fatigue a little earlier in the course. One of the response effects of fatigue is to slow down how quickly your brain processes information. In response to a very simple signal, the brain can take approximately 20 to 30 milliseconds longer than it would when you're bright-eyed and bushy-tailed. The following graph tries to explain this. One of the gold standard measures of behavioural indicators of fatigue is something referred to as the PVT, or psychomotor vigilance task. This is an incredibly well-researched piece of technology and has been used in laboratory studies for nearly 20 years. It's a remarkably simple test. As you can see from the slide, there is effectively a small screen and a light goes on, and as soon as the light goes on, the operator is required to push the button with either the left or the right thumb, depending on whether they are left or right-handed. And if we measure the frequency distribution of response times in tired and alert individuals, you'll see something similar to what is on the graph on the right-hand side of the slide. That is, in an alert individual, you will see a relatively steep increase in the frequency distribution and then a positive skew with a mean response time at around about 225 to 250 milliseconds. If those same individuals are fatigued, that is by keeping them up for an extended period of time or reducing the amount of sleep that those individuals has had, you will see that the distribution of response times moves to the right. So you will see around about a 20 to 30 millisecond increase in the mean response time, and further to the right you will see an increase in very slow responses. What that actually means is that the individual has missed the response. You'll remember back from the slides in the earlier part of the course where we talked about the lapse hypothesis. According to the lapse hypothesis, if the light goes on while you are lapsing, you won't notice it and therefore you will fail to respond, and the response time will be outside of the normal window of responses. The important point to notice here is that there is considerable variability in the response distributions in both the alert and the tired people. You will see that some of the responses in the alert people are in the same place as the tired people and vice versa. That is, the difference between the means is quite small relative to the variability in the distributions of each of those response curves. And this is one of the fundamental problems with reaction times tasks when you're trying to distinguish between alert and tired people. You actually have to do the task many, many times to be really sure whether the individual is fatigued or not. So for example, with the classic PVT administration, people are required to respond for a period of nearly 10 minutes, and they are responding on average once every 10 seconds in a random manner. So if you think about that, that's 100 odd responses that you're required to make in order for us to have statistical reliability in determining whether you are a fatigued or an alert individual. There are many other causes for the variability in these response curves, and partly that is the reason why, while these technologies have been particularly effective in terms of research in the lab at distinguishing and measuring the level of fatigue in individual experiences, they haven't translated particularly well into workplace testing methodologies. And the reasons for this are complex, but we'll try and summarise these in a couple of simple points. The first is that how quickly you respond is not only determined by how tired you are or how alert you are, but also by a range of confounding factors, not least of which is the simple fact of how old you are. As you age, your brain slows down, and so the chances are that if we take a young person and get them to do this task, and an old person to do this task, even if they are both equivalently alert, the older person will appear more tired, or conversely the younger person will seem more alert if you compare their score to a general population average. As a consequence, it becomes sometimes quite difficult to tell the difference between an alert old person and a tired young person. So when these tests are used in the workplace at an individual level, we often find that they are poor at discriminating between people when there is a large age group across the population of workers being studied. There are a number of other factors that also influence these, although these are somewhat less biological. For example, there are social, psychological and cultural factors around how you respond to being tested, how hard you try when you're being tested, what is your response to a negative feedback in terms of your performance. All of these are known to increase the variability of response and make it more difficult to discriminate between people who are tired and people who are alert. One of the ways of dealing with this problem is that in the last few years, a number of the reaction time or response time technologies have shifted away from comparing you to a population average and comparing the individual worker to a history of their own performance. So for example, you might be compared to your previous performance over the last 20 or 30 days. This to a certain extent controls for differences in age group, it controls for differences in strategy, and it controls for differences in motivation and a range of other factors. In general, response time tasks in the last couple of years have typically moved towards a history of response comparison rather than a population comparison. And this does result in better specificity and sensitivity for these tests. Indeed, some of the more recent tests not only control for the factors around demographic variables or motivational, sociocultural variables we've talked about, but they can also control for time of day. As you will remember from what we talked about previously, time awake and time of day are major determinants of cognitive performance in determining the level of fatigue. And again, one of the problems we find in these tasks is if we compare you to a population average, it depends when those tests were taken. So for example, somebody doing a test at 6 o'clock in the morning, even though they are alert, will probably perform more poorly than somebody being tested at the same level of alertness in the early hours of the evening, simply because of the time of day effect, which is a significant modifier of reaction time performance. So some of the more advanced technologies in this area will not only compare you to the history of your own performance, but compare you to the history of your own performance at a particular shift time. So that the testing methodology will go back, and if we are testing you for the start of day shift, go back and test you against your last 20 day shifts or afternoon shifts or night shifts as is appropriate. The second class of fatigue detection technologies fall into the category of those systems that are based on measuring hand-eye coordination. Some of you may remember many years ago, if you'd been to the Adelaide show or the show in your part of the world, that they would have had the side shows where there was a piece of wiggly wire and a handle with a little ring, and your job was to take that piece of wire and then move along the ring. And if you could do that with very good hand-eye coordination, it wouldn't trigger an alarm. If your hand-eye coordination was poor, then the alarm would go off and you wouldn't win a prize. Well, that basic idea has been extended into a number of computer or video-based games in which we measure how well your hand-eye coordination responds to what are often particularly challenging hand-eye coordination tasks. For those of you who are from an Australian background, the most commonly used task in this area is sometimes referred to as the OSPAT test. And in that particular task, some of you will recall that you are presented with a target on a screen and a cursor that jumps off into random points off the centre, and your job is to use the trackball to bring the cursor back into the centre of the screen. Sometimes it can be an unpredictable tracking task where a target area on the screen will evolve over time and you have to move a cursor controlling either a small vehicle or a dot or a random image on the screen in order to keep it in a particular part of the screen. All of those types of tasks measure how well you can identify a change in the position required of the target and how quickly and accurately you can respond to bring the cursor or the target image back into alignment with the state of the system. You remember this from where we talked about the effects of fatigue before. That self-monitoring behaviour is highly sensitive to the effects of fatigue. Hand-eye coordination tasks exploit this effect of fatigue on your ability to respond quickly and accurately. And a number of these technologies have been in the workplace since the mid-90s onwards, and a range of these approaches have been used, again, in the same way as the response time technologies have been used. In the last 10 years, we've seen these same hand-eye task technologies move away from performance assessment based on a population norm to using one which is based on an individual history of performance based on both demographic variables and time of day variables. So again, as with the response time, the hand-eye coordination tasks are a little bit more complicated, and therefore it has been argued are slightly more sensitive to the effects of fatigue, although this is a contentious area. Again, we refer you back to the quite extensive readings on this topic that you will be able to look at on the Moodle site. The third class of technologies are typically those related to changes in eye movement. As anybody who has struggled to stay awake will know, as sleep onset approaches, your eyes will typically tend to close, and in particular there will be what I refer to as slow rolling eye movements. If we put quite sophisticated technology onto you to monitor your eye movements, there are a number of very characteristic changes that occur as people become increasingly sleepy. Not only do your eyes spend more time partially closed, but the rate at which you blink also fundamentally changes. So if we look at blink movements in somebody who is increasingly fatigued, they will blink more slowly, their eyes will stay closed for longer, and they will blink more frequently than they would otherwise do. There have been a whole range of technologies in the last couple of years that have been developed to measure and track eye movement technology. Most of these work on one of two principles. The first principle is to reflect infrared radiation, that is below light spectrum radiation, off the back of your retina, and as you blink or as your eyes close, that beam of infrared light is blocked, and some fancy computer kit that measures the frequency and the duration of those blinks can also calculate the rate of eye movement closure. That technology has been duplicated also using video software technology. This is effectively a video camera that monitors your face and then tracks eye movements based on some computer algorithms. Both of these technologies have a very simple strategy, which is to measure the percentage of time your eyes spend closed and the rate, frequency and duration of eye closure. And as with response times, you can see quite small but statistically significant changes in the rate at which your eyes close and remain closed as you become increasingly fatigued. Probably the first of these technologies was referred to as the Perklow system, which emerged in the mid-90s, but more recently we've seen a number of technologies emerge, such as the Optilert technology in Australia. All of these have shown significant potential in terms of their capacity to identify people when they are fatigued, although interestingly most of the validation work has been done in laboratory-based settings rather than in field settings. The fourth class of technologies are those based around the idea that as one becomes increasingly fatigued, one's brainwaves change. By measuring the frequency and amplitude of brainwaves, it is possible to identify people as they become increasingly sleepy. Without going into too much detail, if we look at the relative ratio of certain power densities in the EEG, it is possible to make very clear decisions about the level of fatigue an individual is experiencing. In recent times, the most common technologies that have been used around this are those that involve the attachment of dry electrodes, either through the use of a cap or glasses or skin attachment. And what will happen is that the brainwaves will be recorded from the scalp, along with eye movements in some cases, and then that information will be passed to a microprocessor that is worn by the individual on their body, and then that will be attached to some kind of alarm. In the same way as you see with the eye movement detection technologies, there will be some proprietary algorithm that will say, for example, either the eye movements are sufficiently slow or the ratio of alpha to theta brainwaves is such that the probability of you being fatigued is sufficiently high to set off an alarm, and there will be either some scale or light or alarm that goes off either for the individual employee or to somebody ostensibly required to monitor those employees at a remote site. But with both the eye movement and brainwave detection technologies, most of the work has involved their evaluation in laboratory settings. It probably is the case that there hasn't been a significant amount of evaluation of these technologies in the field. That is in marked distinction to those based on response time and hand-eye coordination. Those technologies, because they are more mature, have been subject to field evaluations much more consistently than the two that we referred to around eye movement and brainwaves. The last two technologies I'd like to talk about are examples of technologies that made big claims and didn't actually stand up to evaluation. The first of these is called skin conductance, sometimes used to be referred to as galvanic skin response and sometimes electrodermal activity. This was a technology that was developed by a company in Russia called Neurocom, and according to at least to the marketing department of that company, nearly all of the trains in Russia were equipped with this technology. The basic idea behind the technology is that as you remain awake for longer and longer periods, the voltage differential between your skin and earth declines. A bit like the Energizer bunny, as you get increasingly fatigued, you run out of energy. So by measuring the voltage differential between earth and your cells, it's possible to make some decision about the level of fatigue associated with a given individual at a given point in time. You may ask, what's the difference between galvanic skin response or skin conductance as a measure of voltage potential and that of an EEG? The important point to understand is EEG measures alternating current and skin conductance measures direct current. Part of the problem with this technology, and there's kind of an interesting story about this, when we were working with the rail industry back in the mid-90s, this technology was proposed in response to a set of inquiries into a very significant and potentially fatigue-related crash that had happened in New South Wales. One of the recommendations that came out of that inquiry was that driver vigilance control systems in trains needed to be upgraded, and that they wanted to move to a system where there were multiple controls in place, so that if one of them didn't work, the other one would ostensibly identify that individual. So there was much interest and excitement over the introduction of this particular technology, and at the time, while we were undertaking research with the rail industry, we said to them, well, you're about to spend 35 million, so you could probably spend 35,000 working out whether this technology works and the basis on which you might implement it within the trains. To cut a long story short, we actually evaluated that technology and it didn't work particularly well. In fact, the skin conductance technology had almost nothing to do with the alarming systems in it, and it turned out that the only difference between that and a random signal generator was the marketing department. That is, what we found when we evaluated this technology is that it provided a random signal indicating to the individual that their level of fatigue was higher. The question, however, arose is, despite the fact that the technology itself did not have a scientific basis to it, the field trials of this technology had been incredibly well supported by the drivers. Everybody thought it was fantastic, and indeed the marketing department was so keen to tell us about it that they suggested that not only could it tell us if people were tired, but it could also tell us if they were not thinking about the task, i.e. they were distracted and thinking about their girlfriend or what had happened somewhere else today. These were very big claims for this technology, and the investment of $35 million was a really significant safety investment by both the New South Wales and Queensland governments. What was very interesting as a result of evaluating the technology is, despite the fact that people in the field asked to evaluate it thought it was good, but the scientific evidence about whether it actually worked was not particularly convincing. In fact, it was no better than a random signal generator. And again, this leads to one of the interesting things we'll talk about in a while with the introduction of these technologies. There are many sociocultural beliefs around wanting these technologies to work, and in many cases hoping beyond hope that these technologies will work. Part of the issue that we need to think about as organisations is, when the salespeople approach us with these technologies, is how do I ensure that my organisation, if it invests in these technologies, is in a legally and scientifically defensible position. The last of the behavioural measures that I'd like to talk about is the technologies based around the principle of pupil dilation. This is a very well-known phenomena. That is, if I expose you to a flash of bright light, as you would typically see on a camera, and I measure how quickly your pupil constricts in response to that light, that becomes a very good measure of what's referred to as sympathetic or parasympathetic arousal. That is, if you are sleepy, your body responds more slowly and your eye shrinks in size in response to the light more slowly. So there are a number of technologies that have been developed which put people into a controlled situation at the start of the shift and then flash a light into that person's eyes in the dark and then measure the rate at which their pupil constricts. This is an adaptation of medical diagnostic technology which is used for diagnosing people with significant eye problems, but it's been adapted in a way that can potentially test for fatigue. As with many of these other technologies, they are marketed on the fact that they can detect drugs, alcohol and fatigue. And in most of these cases, they do compare people's performance on these tests against either a population or an individual history of performance. One of the problems with the technology when we evaluated the pupil dilation technology was that the population norms that had been developed for this technology were derived from American populations. They had very different levels of Asian, African American, Anglo and Hispanic people. And one of the things that we know from the research is that the rate at which pupil dilation occurs does have a strong genetic component to it. At the time, we suggested to the people marketing this that if it was to be developed further in an Australian market, it would be critical that the underlying population means to be used by that technology should be adapted and developed for an Australian population to reflect the genetic differences in the Australian population. Suffice it to say that the company didn't believe that that was worth the expenditure, and we haven't seen a lot of that particular technology in the last 5 years in Australia. So one of the questions is, what do you need to know as somebody within an organisation about these technologies? And what questions do you need to ask the salesperson when they come knocking on your door? As I said, I don't want to get into the relative strengths, weaknesses, merits or otherwise of all of the individual technologies. And in your readings, you will find some reviews that go through what are the current technologies and what are their strengths and weaknesses. But what I'd like to equip you with is a set of questions that you need to ask yourself, to ask your organisation, and to ask the salespeople who are trying to sell you these technologies. I think the first question I'd like to get you to think about is, what is the basic idea that underpins all of these technologies? And is it a reasonable one? If you think about it, all of these technologies are based on a very simple idea. An individual working in an organisation, or the organisation is not aware that the individual is fatigued. By creating a piece of equipment that measures something, we'll be able to provide that information to the individual. And as a result of that, the organisation and or the individual respond appropriately and stop doing whatever it is that they are doing while fatigued and puts them at risk. The underlying assumption here is that people or organisations don't know that people are tired. And I think that's something you have to think really carefully about. In actual fact, NASA spent millions of dollars 10 or 12 years ago evaluating all of these technologies and trying to work out what was the best predictor of fatigue. And interestingly, it turned out to be asking people. That is, when people were asked to rate their fatigue on a scale, they were extremely good at doing it. Yes, as with alcohol, there was some distortion in their ability to detect impairment at certain levels of fatigue, but by and large, and relative to the technologies that we've talked about, people were really good at doing it. The problem, however, is from an organisational perspective, is that the reason that people continue to do things while fatigued rarely has anything to do with the fact that they don't know that they're fatigued. A driver continues to drive because he's worried about what his dispatcher will say to him if he doesn't get there on time, or he wants the money. On many levels, this is incredibly rational behaviour. People will go, well, I've driven this tired plenty of times before and I've never died before. Why would I die this time? And on one level, they're correct. That is, this is one of the problems that we have in this field, is that fatigue is a low frequency, high consequence accident in many cases. And people don't always fall asleep at the same level of fatigue. It's a variable phenomena. And this leads to a very poor ability to predict whether I will actually fall asleep today at this level of fatigue. The second question you have to ask is, what will happen in the event that I use one of these technologies and it doesn't work and there is an accident? That is what we would politely refer to as a false negative event. That is, the system fails to identify somebody who was fatigued and as a result they had an accident. Part of the challenge that you will have as an organisation is to work out how you will respond legally in the event that that event happens. And for a large organisation, using these technologies for long enough, inevitably that will be the case. We know what the specificity and sensitivity measures for these particular technologies are, and they're not perfect. So the question you have to answer is, when I go to court, I'm going to be asked to justify on what basis I implemented this particular technology. And unfortunately, and I think your corporate lawyers and legal advisors will confirm this, the salesman said it's really good isn't actually a legal defence. One of the problems with these technologies is that the marketing departments are often way out in front of the science departments, and in many cases these technologies have been developed by relatively new startup companies that are undercapitalised, and in many cases in their rush to market either can't afford to do the relevant approval, validation and reliability studies, or even if they do them in the laboratory, often fail to undertake evaluations in the field or undertake evaluations post-implementation. At the end of the day, that's your decision as an organisation how and to what extent you rely on these kinds of technologies, but you will have to be able to answer the question, on what basis did I select this particular technology over another technology, or no technology at all? And the difficulty with this is, in many cases, people tasked with making these purchasing decisions don't necessarily have the level of expertise or understanding of the literature in order to make that decision. One of the things that's really important when you're evaluating these technologies is to ask people to say, show me the scientific evidence supporting its use. And you would typically expect to see data at multiple levels. You would expect to see data establishing that the measure itself in principle is a reliable measure of fatigue. So there will be validation studies, typically against an EEG standard. You would also expect to see the technology in its specific operational implementation tested in a laboratory to show you how well it performed and whether it had good sensitivity and specificity at the product level. And then finally, you would expect to see it implemented into the workplace and evaluated. And it's really important to make sure that you look at all three of those levels, and increasingly into the future we'll expect to see people having looked at implementations that worked technically and actually produced improvements in safety. That is, the technology actually had an impact on safety outcomes. If you apply that criteria, does the technology have peer-reviewed scientific evidence to support it at each of those four levels? I think you will find, and the review article that we referred you to in this particular section of the course will confirm this, is that very few, if any, of the technologies actually pass all four levels of scientific evidence to support them. And this creates a fundamental problem. If you are going to rely heavily on one of these technologies as your primary defence against fatigue, then in my opinion, in many cases, the scientific evidence isn't sufficient to justify that level of reliance on fatigue detection technologies. The last thing I'd like you to think about in terms of these technologies is what happens when you introduce a technology into the workplace, and how does the workplace and the workers respond to that technology? One of the interesting pieces of research that was done a few years ago looked at one of these technologies, the Perclose system, which was a measure of eye movement, and in particular it was a measure of how long your eyes spent closed, that is percentage time closed. That's where the Perclose idea comes from. And they equipped 100 trucks in the US, and those people drove those trucks around for many months. And then over the course of driving those trucks around, there was around about 100 occasions when the technology said effectively to the driver, "Danger, Will Robinson, stop driving immediately, you're at incredible risk." And the question arose is, how often did drivers actually take notice of that? And the answer was almost never. And again, one of the problems that we need to think about these technologies is, how do you actually implement them, and how might they change people's way of responding to the issue of fatigue? Similarly, in the event that somebody was not told that they were fatigued, despite the fact that they were, you may end up in a situation where somebody goes, "Well, the machine says I'm not fatigued, so I will continue driving." You can imagine a scenario where you get a false negative and the driver calls a dispatcher in a particularly competitive organisation and they say, "Well, unless the machine says you're a 5, you keep driving." Over the last 10 years, we have seen computerisation of the workplace fundamentally change the way that people are able to record and monitor individuals' performance. With the introduction of technologies such as GPS, onboard computers and black boxes, we've seen the capacity to actually record, monitor and analyse the behaviour of individuals while they are doing the task. One of the new and emerging areas around level 3 controls, and particularly around fatigue detection technologies, is the shift away from monitoring the individual through some physiological proxy of fatigue and actually measuring the performance of the task. The reasons why we've moved to this approach are both practical and theoretical. At a practical level, one of the issues associated with the use of behavioural measures is the perception that they are invasive, they may contravene civil liberties, and they represent a level of monitoring that many people respond to in the way that we think about a Big Brother initiative. In the US in particular, union opposition to the monitoring of individuals has been high. While not quite as high in Australia, the UK, Canada and New Zealand, nevertheless, employee representative organisations have been particularly strident in their criticism of behavioural monitoring of the individual, or the potential loss of privacy or violation of civil liberties associated with these technologies. If you look in the US, for example, random drug and alcohol testing is not permitted because of the Fourth Amendment rights under the Constitution. That is, you have to establish probable cause before you're allowed to test somebody for the fact of whether they are or are not impaired. As a result, the technologies that we've talked about around behavioural measures could and are most likely to be challenged if there was widespread adoption of them beyond experimental projects. On the other hand, Embedded performance measures actually analyse how you are undertaking and performing on the task, and they don't use a proxy based on individual physiological measures. So if you are driving badly and the vehicle can detect that, and those errors in driving behaviour are consistent with fatigue, then in effect the technology has established the probable cause that enables us to determine whether you should continue to drive or not. If we look at embedded performance measures, they have been most widely adopted into highly computerised environments, and most recently we've seen this in the use of GPS and onboard computer monitoring of vehicles, particularly in the heavy vehicle area. One of the things that you'll remember from what we were talking about earlier in the course is that a tired driver will have increased steering lane variability and increased driving velocity variability. That is, for example, as you go up the hill, you'll be likely to slow down. As you go down the hill, you'll be likely to speed up. And similarly, your lane position on a road will become more variable. Modern GPS enables us to see, for example, how fast you are going relative to the speed limit on that section of road, whether you slow down appropriately with respect to upcoming obstacles or traffic restrictions. Similarly, onboard computers can monitor how well you change gears, relative rates of braking, and in many cases we can observe tired people performing tasks and develop multiple sensors or fused sensor technology that enable us to go, oh, this person is driving like a tired person. And that will enable the system to actually alarm and respond, and perhaps to notify somebody external to the task that this system is not being operated appropriately. I suspect in the next few years we will see some combination of embedded performance measures and physiological monitoring used together to improve the predictive utility of the overall fatigue risk management system. That is, I suspect that we may see embedded measures used to establish probable cause that the driving is poor, and that information then potentially linked with behavioural measures in order to establish that both the individual is fatigued and that their driving is impaired. There are a number of other technologies that have been developed and will be developed over the next years, but I think just before we finalise this session, it's worth thinking about what is the current state of the literature, what is the current state of the technology, and where do I think it's going to go in the next few years. This will be particularly important as you're increasingly faced by vendors trying to promote fatigue detection technologies and deprive your company in many cases of large amounts of money. So where are we with fatigue detection technologies at the moment? I think it's probably fair to say that none of the technologies are sufficiently developed to be used on their own as the sole element of a fatigue risk management system. On the other hand, I think it's probably reasonable to say that they have some potential benefit as part of an overall risk management system. That is, it is not unreasonable to look at the use of level 3 controls in conjunction with other potential controls being in place. The other thing that I think is important to think about is the philosophical approach that goes with these technologies at the moment. Most of them are predicated on what I would refer to as the American drug prevention model. That is, find somebody, detect that they are impaired, and then punish them in some way. That is, the idea is to catch the criminal. And while that has been the dominant paradigm that's used for the development of these technologies, probably because they have been developed by the same companies that developed the initial drug detection technologies, it's not the only way that we could go about this. So for example, it would be entirely reasonable to take an alternate view which says, how might I use a level 3 control, that is a fatigue detection technology, as part of a safety management system? If you look at some of the work that's been done in the mining industry, for example, the companies who are selling some of these fatigue detection technologies will go to a company and recommend that every truck in the fleet be fitted out. And for a company, a big mining company, even in the West, the millions of dollars associated with that initial cost and the significant dollars needed to actually run, monitor and manage that kind of system, it becomes a big question as to whether the amount of money that's being spent is actually a good return on investment given the number of accidents that would be prevented. One of the things to think about is how might I use this technology intelligently? So for example, where an organisation sits down to look at the use of for example, a eye closure detection technology on a mining truck and says, well, I should equip every truck so I can identify any driver who is fatigued and spend a lot of money, that's one way of doing it. On the other hand, if you take the additional controls we've talked about so far, if we identified that a certain number of individuals were fatigued based on their prior sleep-wake scores, perhaps I could take 5 or 6 trucks out of 100 and equip them with that technology. So on the day that somebody was at an elevated risk of fatigue due to insufficient sleep, they could be assigned to the truck that was equipped with the OptAlert equipment or some other form of equipment. It's not to say that the equipment in and of itself is good or bad, but the way we choose to use it becomes critically important in evaluating its use within the fatigue risk management system. Similarly, why is it that most of the implementations of this technology are about monitoring and responding to the fatigued individual? I could equally use this technology to apply it to a group of workers across a roster, de-identify that data and say, I had 35 reports of somebody being fatigued above a score of 4 on that particular shift, and we introduce a technology that shows we've now reduced that to 5% of events over that threshold approach. So what you can see is the choice on how to use these technologies is often culturally determined, and it's often determined by what will maximise the expenditure by the company on the technology being sold by the vendor. And that's completely understandable. I think the technology has now reached a point where it is suitable for the collection of data for group behaviour at the de-identified level. I think it is probably suitable for use as a control for the management of people who are considered at risk as part of a group. But what I don't think the technology is suitable for is what it's most commonly sold for. That is to monitor an individual accurately as your single line of defence. Now, over the last few years, the companies purveying these technologies have become more sophisticated and are starting to argue that these technologies be embedded within a broader fatigue risk management system. But where one of the challenges lies at the moment is it's very difficult for an organisation to bring all of those elements together. We still haven't reached the point where fatigue management consultants are actually bringing all of the fatigue risk management technologies and layers of control and developing them into what are called turnkey solutions or applications for the companies who are looking to manage fatigue. I suspect over the next 10 to 20 years we will start to see a consolidation of that market, and we will start to see these technologies used in a broader way. I think we'll see them used in a way that is much more consistent with the safety management systems approach. And I think we will probably start to see a fusing of both these technologies and other levels of control in the system to provide a best overall systems approach. The fatigue detection technologies that we've been talking about in the last section are probably at the Rolls-Royce end of the scale for level 3 controls. There are level 3 controls which are quite simple, practical and inexpensive to use, and these can be divided into 2 broad categories. There are behavioural scales. These are typically psychological instruments or scales that have been used and developed, and they have good psychometric properties, and most importantly, they're free. The second categories are what we call symptom checklists, and these are checklists of symptoms or behavioural changes in the way somebody performs a task, typically through either self or peer identification, and we'll talk about those a little bit later. If we go back and start with the behavioural scales, there are 3 scales that are typically used for assessing fatigue in workplaces. They are the Karolinska Sleepiness Scale, This rates fatigue using a set of behavioural anchors on a scale from 1 to 9. There is the Stanford Sleepiness Scale, which rates using behavioural anchors on a scale of 1 to 5. And then there is the Sam Perelli Sleepiness Scale, which ranks on a scale from 1 to 7. All of the scales are effectively the same. The differences lie in where they have been used and in what industries they've been used, and the relative importance you will assign to being able to benchmark data obtained in your workplace against data obtained in other workplaces. All other things being equal, we would recommend the use of the Karolinska Sleepiness Scale for a couple of reasons. One, it has probably the most extensive database across industries. It's been well validated and used extensively in both scientific and field studies, and it has an extremely attractive option of being free. The second scale, which has much the same qualities other than the scale is slightly compressed, is the Stanford Sleepiness Scale. This was developed, not surprisingly, at the Stanford Center for Sleep Research back in the 60s. And lastly, the Sam Perelli Sleepiness Scale. That has been used extensively in aviation and defence, and for people looking to benchmark in those areas, the Sam Perelli Sleepiness Scale can be quite useful. There are some limitations to the scales. In particular, the Sam Perelli scale has a problem in the sense that the scale rating of 7, that is unable to continue my task safely, is very rarely used by people in real world settings because of the potential legal consequences in the event that they did have an accident. But that aside, all of the scales are approximately equal, have good validation data, good reliability data, and they have good psychometric properties in terms of their use both in the field and in the laboratory. One of the things that is important to think about here too is which behavioural scales should you not use. And one of the difficulties we've had, particularly in Australia, is the Epworth Sleepiness Scale was developed for the identification and assessment of sleep apnea. And as such, it's based on functional behaviours typically associated with people suffering sleep apnea. The problem with this scale is while it's called a sleepiness scale, it's actually a clinical diagnostic scale and is typically inappropriate for use in workplaces, particularly when you're looking at fatigue levels associated with shift work. Symptom checklists represent another simple, straightforward way to assess fatigue in the workplace. Rather than having people rate their fatigue on a scale from either 1 to 5, 1 to 7 or 1 to 9, symptom checklists look for people to be able to identify either in themselves or in a co-worker symptoms consistent with fatigue-related behaviour. As you will see from the following table, we use a very simple exercise whereby we bring a group of workers together and we talk to them in a workplace setting and ask them to fill out the following table. And as you'll see from the table, there are physical symptoms and then task-related symptoms. And then we divide that into 3 domains: physical, mental, and affective. The way we go around this is to sit down with a group of people and ask them, based on their experience in the industry and in the task that is under consideration, how do you know that somebody you're working with, or how do you know if you yourself are fatigued, what are the typical behaviours that you will manifest? And people will talk about things like, well, I notice that the person next to me doesn't talk so much, or they become terse, or they might talk about the fact that somebody starts to yawn or stretch or turn the radio up, or there may be a whole range of activities that they undertake. The second aspect of that discussion we have with employees, and that follows the other row in the table, is to ask them for the ways in which task performance is altered at the physical, mental or affective level. And we might go around the group and ask them to say, well, how do you know if somebody is tired undertaking the task from a physical perspective? And somebody might say, okay, well, I notice that the person is leaning back in their chair in a control room environment. At a mental level, they might say something along the lines of, I notice that people take longer to initiate a behaviour that they're meant to do, and they'll sit there and delay making a decision. Or it may be at the affective level where they say the authority gradient steepens, or that person gets grumpy and won't listen to bad information about what's happening in the system. But what we will do for a specific workforce group is to ask them as a group to fill out that particular table, and then we will give them some very simple criteria. And for example, we might fill out that table and then say, if you identify in yourself or somebody else 3 symptoms within a 15-minute period, then that's prima facie evidence that somebody you're working with is at a significantly elevated level of fatigue, and that constitutes the basis for doing something about it. So in the same way as we operationalised fatigue from a sleep-wake perspective, which is to say if you have had less than 5 hours sleep or less than 12 hours sleep in the prior 24 or 48 hours, again we are operationalising how to identify a fatigued individual based on the signs or symptoms either at the personal or at the task-related level. Now the question is, should it be 3 in 15 minutes or 2 in 8 minutes or 5 in 20 minutes? We picked 3 in 15 minutes because it has reasonable discriminative ability. That is, it's unlikely that someone would exhibit 3 symptoms within a 15-minute period and not be tired, and conversely, all of the symptoms that we've talked about may be occasionally implemented or undertaken by people when they are tired. So if you set it too sensitively, you'll get people saying they're tired all the time when they're probably not. So the 3 in 15 is a simple pragmatic rule that enables people to only have to count up to 3 and to only have to worry about a 15-minute period. The point being is, once that you've identified that yourself or another person has experienced 3 symptoms in a 15-minute period, it gives you permission to do something about it. That is, identify that fact to your co-worker. If it's nothing more than that, that will have a significant potential to reduce risk in the longer run. In some organisations, this will be done quite formally. Symptoms may be checked and documented as part of an incident management system. In other organisations, it may merely remain as a peer-to-peer behaviour. Again, going back to our original principle that we talked about before, you have to take the tools that we have created here and work out what is the most appropriate way to implement them in your organisation. And in order to work that out, you have to understand at what level of development your organisation is. You don't want to be in a position where you're trying to force a system that's over-sophisticated for your level of developmental maturity. Here lies one of the key challenges of developing a fatigue risk management system, because not only do you have to be aware of the controls that are available at each level, but you have to be able to think about what is the appropriate level of implementation at my organisation now, and what can I aspire to in terms of that implementation over the next 6, 12 or 18 months.